Grace and peace be multiplied to each one here this morning. Glad to see each of you. Welcome to our visitors. Good to see some old friends. And when I say old friends, I mean friendships that go back a ways. So welcome to you, old friends. I won't call you out by name. But welcome to each one. And you can turn your Bibles to 1 Corinthians 11. If you're a visitor with us this morning, we are studying 1 Corinthians. I am studying 1 Corinthians whenever I have the message. We're going through the book of 1 Corinthians. We are in chapter 11, and we have came through verses 1 to 16, and now, as I mentioned last time, we will be in verses 17 to 34. And as a title for the sermon this morning, I believe it was early this morning when I was thinking about this subject, and toward the end of my notes, I wrote, what the Corinthian church was actually doing is profaning the Lord's Supper. And so that's what I'm going to title the sermon this morning, Profaning the Lord's Supper, as you may have seen in the bulletin. But before we read this section, I want to address two questions / conversations that I've had with people here on the previous verses. And I'll try not to take too much time, but the first question might take a little bit of time because I want to give a little, I want to set it up, I guess, so you understand where the nature of the question. And so, actually, I had two different people on two different occasions talk to me about this, and it comes from verse 10. So if you want to look down at verse 10, it is a good question, and I want to give you, maybe use those of you that have asked this question or have had a discussion about this, an opportunity to respond if you wish. You don't have to after I explain. But the question is, what is the power or authority on the woman's head that's referred to in verse 10? And so I'll give you the definition of the word. The Greek word is exousia, and it does mean power, authority, domain, jurisdiction, charge. Those are a few words that are in the definition. Control, I believe, is in there in the definition. So earlier in this passage, here I'll give a little bit of backdrop to this. Paul's talking about the authority structure in verses, I believe, 3, and how it is Christ, man, woman. They each have a head, and the head over all is God. And then you also have passages like, I mentioned this in the first message on chapter 11, passages like Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, I believe it is, 1 Timothy 2, there's 5 of them. 1 Corinthians 14 is another one, and 1 Peter 3. Each of these passages speaks about a woman's place or the way a woman relates to her husband. And they all speak either of submission, I believe, and a couple of the passages use the word subjection, to which our culture finds quite objectionable. And so, and I agree that it can be abused. But those are the words used in those passages. So I guess the question is, how do we harmonize verse 10 with the beginning of this chapter, the other 5 passages that I mentioned and that we're not going to read. And so is Paul, I guess the question is, Paul suddenly changing his message and saying, women, you now have authority and you now have power and you now have jurisdiction, which is what this word means. And so more questions to bring, or I'll just ask them, does this exousia refer to a power or authority to which the woman is subject? Does it refer to the covering she wears on her head, which is what this passage speaks about? Or is it the woman's own power and authority? And so as you can guess, in my first message on this, which I think I had possibly 5 in the beginning of this chapter, and you're probably tired of it. And so, but we're going to try to cover this question at least. As you can guess, the egalitarian crowd, so I spoke of that in the first message. You have the egalitarian mindset versus a complementary mindset, where basically, I don't know if I should go into trying to explain that all. I think you all know what I mean by that term, or a lot of you. I guess I just say this: the egalitarian mindset is that a woman is equal to a man in leadership, in the home and in the church. And the complementarian view is that the woman complements the man. Just in short, that would be it. And so they do, the egalitarian crowd likes this verse to give them traction in their what they believe, and especially the NIV and I'm going to say the KJV translations of this verse. So let us look at a few translations, and it will become evident that all translators there's not enough information here, and so they do a little speculating, I guess we'll say. So and if you want to do a study on translations, it would be a very good thing. I want to do more. I have done some in the past and maybe a little recently, but you can categorize English translations of the Bible into basically 3 categories, and it is formal equivalence. You might run across that if you study it, functional equivalence, and then free translations. I'll just kind of throw that out there. And the first would be more of a word-for-word translation. Think King James Version Bible. The second would be functional. They say dynamic. It would be more idea for idea. And the third method would just simply be somewhat of a paraphrase. And so I'm going to read this verse in the NIV, which the NIV falls under, so functional, kind of idea for idea. The NIV says, "It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels." The New Living Translation, which some would say is not a translation, it's a paraphrase, so it's actually farther down the line, if you want to say it that way. It says, "So a woman should wear a covering on her head as a sign of authority because the angels are watching." And so then you have the New King James, the ESV, the New Revised Standard, the New American Standard, the Christian Standard Bible, Holman Christian Standard. They all would say a woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. So is this meaning a symbol of her authority? Think Queen Elizabeth, maybe with a crown on her head. That's a symbol of her authority, right? Is that what the verse is saying, or is it a symbol that she is under authority? And that's a big difference right there. And if you study the original language, which I said before, it's all Greek to me. I'm not a Greek scholar. But if you study the original, you will find the phrase, a symbol of authority, was added by the translators for clarity. And that is the most popular way to translate this verse. And more of the translations that I have given you, they fit and they translate it that way. They fit it in that way. They use a symbol of. But is that accurate? And I know I'm not one to question the translators. They have reasons why they do things. The original Greek, the way I understand it, correct me those of you that know if I'm wrong, the original Greek is stated more accurately in the KJV. And it says, "For this cause ought the woman to have power on her head because of the angels." So what is this power or authority on her head? Or where does it come from? Is this contradicting the other 6 places in the Bible that we could turn to, but that's not our message this morning, that instruct women to be in submission, subjection, not to have teaching roles in the church, etc.? Is this verse contradicting that? So your thoughts, please. And you don't, if you don't, I know you didn't have any time to think about it. If you don't want to comment, you don't need to. I'm just going to give that opportunity right now.
The position of the angels. They were in subject to the authority of God and Christ. So they're in a sense duplicating or replicating the angels.
Yeah.
So the angels had a position of subordination as would be the women who are covering her in that sense of subordination. We have to look at the reflection of what the angels were,
Yeah.
their position were, compared to what the women are.
Right. Yeah, and we went over some of that few messages back, and I appreciate that. And the other thing we could, if we were actually really going to spend a lot of time on this, we could say, for this cause, for what cause? He says, for this cause, ought the woman to have power on her head. For what cause? And I would have jumped to the preceding verses, and the cause, I would have said the cause would have been in the 2 statements he makes before about man is not of the woman, and also the woman was created for the man, for that cause. And so does that fit? So thank you for that, Rich. Anyone else?
I think the context is clear that it's not contradicting the other passages as far as that concept. I think we could rule that out pretty clearly. And all the effort that is put into this passage itself makes that, I think, very abundantly clear. It is a difficult passage to try to grasp. I think the way I would look at it
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I was going to comment on something you said there. But that would have been, yeah, that would have been my thought. You have all these other writings, and not just from Paul. One is from Peter. Paul's, well, he did the letter to Timothy. Was there another writer? Anyway, I don't believe, which some people would say, oh, now Paul is, basically they're saying, oh, he's giving women the authority. He just undid what he started at the beginning of this chapter, which I don't believe. I think that's inconsistent interpretation. My thought would have been somewhat like Steve's. I did write down, women have power, authority when they are functioning / thriving in their God-given role in God's authority structure. And then I believe this next statement comes from, it was one of the Greek lexicons, and I didn't write it down, so I'm not sure which one. And they were talking about delegated power. It says delegated power refers to the authority God gives to his saints, authorizing them to act to the extent that they are guided by faith. And so, yeah, that would be my, I guess, explanation or answer to that question. And you brought up an interesting thought there, Steve. Got my mind wheels turning. The power that God gives when they are in obedience to a simple instruction. And you could go, that's, I guess, well, it is sort of the message. I was going to say it's not the message, but you could, I guess it's the difference related to our subject this morning, speaking of the Lord's Supper or the communion table, the difference between viewing that as an ordinance or a sacrament. It's going to make some of you uncomfortable. But basically, the way I would understand the difference is the one would believe it is a means by which grace, or could I say power, grace, could use the word grace, power, is conveyed to the believer. And you could actually, you made actually a little bit of reference to that, whether this act, obeying this, the power that is on her head is in the obedience and submission to this simple command here. So interesting thing to think of there. Let's move on to another question that was asked, and we will get to our study. This question, number 2, is taken from verse 15. If the woman's long, and this was, I think, the last message I had, if the woman's long hair is not the covering that Paul is advocating for, then what does the statement actually mean her hair is given to her for a covering? And the reason this question was asked is because I spent quite a bit of time, a substantial amount of time, looking into why I think it's very unlikely that the covering that Paul is referring to in this passage was a woman's long hair. But I spent virtually no time in explaining what it actually was. And so that was why this question was given. And so this phrase, her hair is given her for covering, is part of the previous 2 verses, verses 13 and 14. We'll just go to 14, where Paul brings in nature as an example and zeroes in on long hair. And he says, on men, so long hair on men, it is a shame. On a woman, it is a glory to her. Opposite result based on your gender, or whether you're a man or a woman. And he says, does not nature even teach you this? And then he goes on to make the statement he does. And so basically, commentators, some of them would say, in answer to the question I asked, well, what actually is Paul saying then if the long hair is not her covering? And quote, if a woman has naturally long hair, which is given to her as a covering for her head, the covering of her head should be no shame to her. Therefore, let her wear a veil. That's the commentator. Another commentator, nature provides an example for us, and women should follow the example that nature teaches them. And you may think kind of like me, you mean that's it? Like that's the explanation? Just that? Like, but if you read the passage carefully and you see that there are two different coverings indicated by two different Greek words, also you have to explain verse 6, and also you have to explain what an uncovered man looks like. Therefore, you cannot conclude that these are the same thing. In short, this is nature's example. So now we're going to move on. I think I spent enough time on that. We're going to read, and I believe we're going to read just verses 17 to 22. Because as I looked down through this passage, I didn't do a lot of like what headings could I give, but I just felt it was broke up very easily broke up, and so I put like 4 points to it, which we're not going to cover them all this morning. We're going to cover the first one. The abuse of the Lord's Supper, verses 17 to 22, the practice of this ordinance / sacrament, depending on how you view that. That's in verses 23 to 26. And so Paul, after he tells them, hey, you're abusing this practice, then he goes back and, by the way, this is how this practice started. And he gives that, which some of them may not even have known. And so that's the second point. And then the warnings regarding this practice and the consequences of the abuse of this tradition or practice. Okay, I'm going to read verses 17 to 22, 1 Corinthians 11. Now in this that I declare unto you, I praise you not, that ye come together not for the better, but for the worst. For first of all, when ye come together in the church, I hear that there be divisions among you. And I partly believe it. For there must be also heresies among you, that they which are approved may be made manifest among you. When ye come together, therefore, into one place, this is not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating everyone taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry and another is drunken. What? Have ye not houses to eat and to drink in? Or despise ye the church of God, and shame them that have not? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I praise you not. And so we spoke about unity in our Sunday school class, and here's an example of disunity from verse 18. Divisions. I hear that there are divisions among you. And then Paul, I notice he mentions 3 times when you come together. When you come together in the church, when you come together in one place. And this is important for the church of Jesus Christ. And as Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, it's important for us to come together, to meet together. And to their credit, they were meeting together. You know, the writer of Hebrews instructs his readers, and that would include us today, not to neglect the assembling of ourselves together, the assembly of the saints, the gathering of the believers, whatever you want to say, as some do. So a few thoughts on Christians meeting together. It's something that has entered my mind recently, different times in regard to, The Bible commands us, as we saw here, to meet together. When we meet together, what should we be doing? According to the early church tradition and according to the scriptures. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit. So, you know, we use the phrase occasionally, we're going to church. And I found it interesting, reading recently, I believe it was about the Plymouth Brethren, that they would not refer to, if you notice, they refer to their buildings, or they refer to their church gathering as assemblies. Basically, when the church assembles, or I forget what other word they might have used. I don't know if it's chapel, the assembly, but they specifically made a point that the church is the body of Christ, and they assemble in a building known as a church. And so we can, they distinguish between the two, which I believe we should. The gathering of the saints, the assembly of believers, I believe is better. So the question is, what should our church gatherings consist of when we assemble together, according to the Bible and early church history? Paul does address this later in chapter 14 when he cautions them against a possible, it seems like they were possibly having a chaotic assembly in chapter 14 there. The verse in chapter 14, when you come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation. And then he gives this principle, this overarching principle, let all things be done for edification. So that's a principle that we can get a hold of today, and we can base our gathering or our worship service on. A few verses here. Hebrews 10 tells us to consider how to stir one another up to love and good works, encouraging each other in the faith. That can happen in an assembly of believers. Colossians 3, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms, hymns, spiritual songs with thankfulness. 1 Thessalonians 5, encourage one another and build each other up. That can happen in the gathering. Acts 2, the early church continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine and fellowship, in breaking of bread and in prayers. In Acts 20, on the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread. And so there's just a few examples that God wants his people to do when they gather together. Some common themes in the verses are encourage each other in the faith, edify, teach, admonish, sing, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the functions of the church is to stir each other up to love and to good works. But in this case, in chapter 11 here, the Corinthian church, the meetings were having, their church gatherings, their assembly of the believers were having the opposite effect. Paul tells them in verse 17, you come together, when you come together, I praise you not that you come together not for the better, but for the worse. So essentially, you could read that their meetings were doing more harm than good. Would that be a stretch to say that? He's saying you're coming together not for the better, not to better one another, but it's actually worse. It appears, I don't think it would be a stretch to say it was doing more harm. It was causing more division than it was doing stirring up each other to love and good works. And that, by the way, we spoke of unity. That is a result of having division in the church body. Verse 18 speaks of that, divisions among you. So verse 19, when divisions occur, there are things that are made manifest. That's not a word we use that often, maybe hardly at all in our English language, but it was used in our Sunday school this morning, and it's used here again. Made manifest. It becomes evident or becomes apparent. That's kind of the definition. I'd like to look at that word in the King James here. There must be also heresies among you. And that's not quite the meaning that I would have put to that word in the Greek. This word here means factions or a sect. And they gave the definition, a strong, distinctive opinion. That word means. And so if you think an example of this would be the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jesus' day in the Gospels where it talks about them. They were both part of Judaism, but they were a sect, a part of a bigger picture, and it was a faction inside of Judaism. And so that is what this word heresy means in verse 19. And so verse 19, if I was to paraphrase it using the definitions that I looked up of those words, I wrote down, it would say, there must be strong, distinctive opinions or factions among you, that they which are genuine, which is they which are approved, they which are genuine might be made evident among you. And so this division, heresies, these factions made it evident which people were doing what Paul said, what is approved. If you were wise and discerning, you could pick up which actions were approved and which actions were wrong. Basically, like a coin expert, somebody that's used to looking at coins and old coins, and I've already saw them. They pull out this. It's a little magnifying glass, and they look very, very closely at the markings and at, I don't know, the metal, what they all look at to determine, is this coin genuine or is this a fake? And so they look very closely at it. The definition also is tried and tested. Approved, that is the word approved. So verse 20, now down to verse 20, Paul informs them here in Corinth what they were doing was something other than eating the Lord's Supper or observing the Lord's Supper. And I don't know if that came as a shock to them. Verses 21 and 22, Paul describes some of what was going on in the church. But before that, twice in this passage, verses 21 and 23, he uses the term, where is it? Oh, it's not the words that I've written down, but he highlights the fact that they were eating together. I think I have the wrong verse there. When you come together, therefore, into one place, it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. For in eating, everyone taketh before the other his own supper. One is hungry and another is drunken. I think I got this from another verse later in the passage. I believe it's verse 33 now that I'm looking down. Wherefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, tarry one for another. And so it's something that I thought of, and we can apply this to our practical, like family living. There's something bonding about a church eating together. In this case, the Lord's Supper, the communion service, or just eating a meal together. And sometimes, at home we don't eat every meal together. But I try to make it a point sometime, well, where's this person or where's this person? They should be here, because there's something unifying or bonding about all eating together. And in our current lifestyle, sometimes maybe we don't put the priority on eating together that we should. There's something special about everyone eating together, because you can go, sometimes it's you may do this, everyone fend for themselves. You just go, there's some food, you just go prepare it and say a little prayer, and you just eat your food by yourself, and the next person's eating there and there. And it's not the same as when there's a meal prepared, you all sit down, you have a formal prayer, and then you all start eating together. There's nothing like that. And I think it's the same in the church. It's very important in the home and in the church. And the abuse here, some were coming quite hungry to this occasion, this meal, the Lord's Supper. This was their meal. Some were getting drunk. Some were shaming those that had nothing. It speaks about that either here or later in the passage. And it seems to me that there was a party aspect to something that was supposed to be sacred. And so that's why profaning the Lord's Supper, I believe earlier this morning when I was sitting down there, it's like, hey, this to some was a party. They got drunk, they came hungry, they're going to eat a big meal. And also, if you read some commentary, I believe I got the idea that there were factions. The rich had their good meal over here. The poor could eat this, because you weren't part of this group, so there was division. It wasn't that they were all eating together. And he tells them at least two places, wait for your brother. I think that is also in verse 34. No, it's in verse 33. Wherefore, my brethren, when ye come together to eat, tarry for one another. And if any man be hungry, let him eat at home. And so, what I'd like you to take out of these verses is that the people, or what we want to notice is, in the way that they were profaning this was now a party, and it was supposed to be sacred. And to the point, and that's why Paul says, to the point where he says, you're not even practicing the Lord's Supper anymore. That's not what this is. And he called them out on that. You think you're observing the Lord's Supper. It's not. I'm telling you, it's something other than what the Lord Jesus Christ had in mind. And that's why he then goes into verse 23 and explained to them, for I have received of the Lord that which I also delivered to you. And then he explains the practice, how it originated, etc. And we know the story behind the practice. And I believe we'll look at that the next time. Maybe the practice, and also then the next 2 points, which is some warnings and some consequences for the profaning of the practice that they were doing. So I'm going to stop with that. I will give opportunity if anyone has anything that they would like to say regarding this passage or the anything here in chapter 11, a question or a comment, I'll give you opportunity.